fellow Who Gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the new podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. This is a landmark episode for Doctor Who Literature. It's episode 10, the first double-digit episode number. 90 more of these, and we'll get to triple digits. Today's book is Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen by Terrance Dicks. There's a lot to discuss, an awful lot to discuss about this book and its place in the target line, its prose, its taking liberties with the original and now mostly lost TV serial, and what place a story like this with its suspect casting and accent choices has in our 21st century world. I'll be joined today by Jonathan Blum, a prolific Doctor Who novelist making his first appearance on the program. John's perspective on the book is fascinating, and I hope you'll stick around for the second half of the broadcast to hear my interview with him. But before we get to the book, there's some more breaking news to discuss. Now, it comes via the Daily Mirror, so it might not be news at all, but several other blogs have repeated the story, and it has the ring of truth to it. Here's a sample of what I read on other blogs. According to the Daily Mirror, the upcoming reconstruction of the Patrick Troughton serial, The Abominable Snowmen, will reportedly be the last animation produced for the missing episodes. The apparent reason for this is BBC America pulling their funding from the initiative after a partnership with BBC Studios enabled the animations to be produced for DVD and Blu-ray release and airing on BBC America afterward. The article provides a quote from an insider who elaborated on what this means for the future of the range. End of extract. Now, there are questions raised by this. If it's true, why cancel the animations now? They've been going on for years. The current story, being animated, contributes to a lot of the questions. What if the people paying for these animations found out what story was being animated now, with its whitewashed casting and borderline offensive accents and far less than enlightened portrayal of Buddhism? If the animations are dead, is it this story that's responsible for killing them? Perhaps it's just as well that we'll now likely never see a commercial release of an animated episode 3 of Marco Polo, which poses the exact same problems. This is, as I said, a breaking news story, and it comes from the Mirror, so again, might not even be news at all. Maybe there will be lots more animations, but it's fitting that this story, and its link to the Abominable Snowmen, happened to break the same week that I'm recording and releasing my one and only podcast episode dedicated to the novelization of the Abominable Snowmen. So, let's get to it. Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Abominable Snowmen, written by Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln, televised September through November 1967, published in November 1974. Here's the back cover blurb to my 1983 edition of the Target paperback. The Tibetan monks at the monastery of Detsen are worried, frightened men. Many of their companions have been killed, and it seems the Yeti are the cause of all their troubles. But normally the Yeti, giant man-like creatures living in the remotest peaks of the Himalayas, are seen only very rarely, and are notoriously timid. What is the explanation for their apparent transformation into ferocious brutes? Monsters with glowing eyes and savage fangs who are spreading death and destruction in the isolated Valley of Peace. When the Doctor arrives at the monastery, his first visit for 300 years, he expects to be welcomed with open arms. But because of the mysterious killings, the reception that awaits him is anything but friendly. Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen, when published in late 1974, broke a streak of 6 consecutive Third Doctor novelizations. In fact, this is the first true past Doctor adventure. The 3 Frederick Muller novelizations all came out during the same Hartnell era where they took place, And while 1974 was John Pertwee's final year as the Third Doctor, and while he had bowed out in Planet of the Spiders that June, all of the first 6 Pertwee novelizations were released before Tom Baker's proper debut story, Robot, hit the screens the last week of the year, and about a month after this book was released. So the novelization of The Abominable Snowmen is quite a different animal, pardon the pun, or not. The book came out over 7 years after the TV episodes aired, and about 5.5 years after Patrick Troughton's final appearance as the lead. So it's the first retro novelization. The opening chapters of Abominable Snowmen are exhilarating, because this is Terrance introducing Patrick Troughton, the man who was the Doctor when Dicks began working for the show, to a new audience, to kids who quite possibly were too young to have seen or remember the Abominable Snowmen on TV. This means that the first 2 chapters of Snowmen spend a little more time than usual establishing the Doctor and his 2 by then long gone companions, Victoria and Jamie. But first, we get our first good, true Terrance Dicks style description of the TARDIS's arrival. He featured the TARDIS briefly in his first novelization, Doctor Who and the Auton Invasion, but then his second adaptation, of Day of the Daleks, was a TARDIS-free story. This is the first time that we actually get inside the console room. So, this is what Terrance writes. Next morning, a little higher on that same Himalayan peak, a wheezing, groaning sound shattered the peace and stillness of the mountain air. An old blue police box appeared from nowhere, transparent at first, but gradually becoming solid. It perched on a snow ledge, looking completely out of place. Inside the police box was an ultra-modern control room, with a center console of complex instruments. There was something very odd about this police box. Somehow, it was bigger on the inside than on the outside. Variations on this theme will appear in just about every subsequent Dicks novelization, although at this early date he hadn't yet described the center console as many-sided. But I gotta tell you, I got chills just reading the words wheezing, groaning sound. And then comes the way Terrance describes the TARDIS crew. He says, there were 3 people in the control room. One was a middle-aged, middle-sized man with a gentle, rather comical face and a shock of untidy black hair. He was wearing an old black coat and a pair of rather baggy check trousers. The mysterious traveler in space and time known only as the Doctor. After Victoria and Jamie are introduced, Victoria then reflects on just what the Doctor is like. He says, Victoria sometimes wondered if her decision to join the Doctor had been a wise one. He was very kind in his vague, erratic way, and she was very fond of him, but he did seem to have a knack of wandering into the most appalling danger. It's interesting that Dicks chooses Victoria as his audience identification figure in these opening scenes, and by and large the rest of the book. Her character was from the 19th century, an orphan, but it's through her eyes that Dicks interprets the Second Doctor, since the target house style at the time was to minimize scenes told from the Doctor's own POV. Dicks plays up Victoria's innate strengths, and he says despite her initial timidity, she was discovering resources of courage inside herself. Now this is an interesting and brave choice. Victoria as a companion on TV, often used as what Elizabeth Sandiford described as a peril monkey. But even if Victoria was often written in a one-dimensional way, as a screamer, she was played very well by Deborah Watling. And you get the sense, from reading Terrance's descriptions, that he's really writing Deborah Watling, a really talented actress, playing an underwritten role. For all of the issues that fandom may have with Victoria's characterization, it's Jamie who's played off as the more cartoonish figure. Terrance writes, he, Jamie, welcomed each new adventure with tremendous gusto. Jamie was a fighter by nature. English redcoat soldier or alien monster, it was all the same to Jamie. He grabbed his trusty claymore and charged. Dicks makes the, from a 2022 perspective, somewhat puzzling decision to type all of Jamie's scripted lines in dialect, just in case we, didn't realize that Jamie was Scottish rather than English. There are tons of achs and maybes and dunnakens. To the modern day new series fan, what with Karen Gillan and Peter Capaldi proudly owning their native accents, with David Tennant narrating audiobooks in his Scottish burr, and with Jodie and Dan and Yaz in Series 13 all proudly speaking in regional accents, there's nothing unusual about Doctor Who's cast having a variety of accents. In the 1960s, we pretty much got Cockney spoken by lower class soldiers or Ben Jackson, RP for everybody else, including Dodo after her first 2 weeks, and then there's Jamie in Scottish. The use of dialect to separate Jamie out from all the other characters quite possibly made a lot of sense when the novelizations were being written, but from today's viewpoint, it seems more like an effort to dehumanize the character. I'm sure the target writers believed they were doing all this in good fun. Jerry Davis would do it as well for his upcoming adaptation of the Moonbase. But on the printed page, it does now look kind of odd. It's been pointed out in Running Through Corridors that Jamie's role as a young 18th century man who constantly needed technology explained to him was quickly glossed over by the production team in order to play up the undeniable chemistry that Troughton had with Fraser Hines. By the time of Tomb of the Cybermen, Hines had Jamie laughing genuinely at the Doctor's complete mental breakdown quip, which in context should have made no sense to the character at all. But here, writing a later serial, The Abominable Snowmen, Dicks portrays Jamie as still very much the Doctor's student. He writes, "What was it that the Doctor was always on about? The exercise of logical thought." Even when the Doctor is paying Jamie a compliment, it sounds about as backhanded as something Winston Churchill might have said witheringly about a political adversary. "Go on, Jamie," said the Doctor encouragingly. He knew that although the Scots lad was more of a fighting man than a thinker, he had a shrewd, quick mind, especially where practical problems were concerned. And of course, Jamie's 18th century gender politics are always worth a good double take. "I'm getting very bored," Victoria said. "Couldn't we take a look outside?" Jamie shook his head. "The doctor said to wait here." "I'll go by myself." Victoria stood up decisively. Jamie sighed. It was in the nature of females to be contrary. End quote. Because Doctor Who was produced back in the day with a week or more of rehearsals followed by only 4 to 6 days of taping for any given serial, you often find a wide gulf between script and screen. The author's final scripts would get sent to rehearsal and would often come out quite different after the director and lead actors and script editor had their say. We, as fans, know about the differences because the novelizations were usually based on the earlier scripts, and we've read the novelizations a dozen times each. But by now, we've seen the TV episodes at least as often and have already memorized two different versions of the same story. In reading any novelization, but especially one featuring a very visual and inventive, improv-flavored Doctor, such as Patrick Troughton or Tom Baker, the mere words on the page often just fail to capture the anarchic quality of that Doctor. We'll talk about this a lot more in the coming weeks and months of this podcast as we get to print Tom Baker, who's a more sedate figure than TV Tom Baker. Print Baker is much less prone to over-dramatically declaiming Shakespeare over a Cyberman's corpse, or hurling ad-libbed insults at rubber-masked aliens, or finding comical ways to enter doors. But in reading this first Patrick Troughton novelization, Dicks is aware that he's writing for a clownish, attention-grabbing character, an alien. Early in his first appearance here, Dicks writes, the Doctor started ferreting inside the chest, rather like a dog at a rabbit hole, throwing things over his shoulder with gay abandon. Jamie and Victoria looked on in amazement. After a moment, the Doctor's head popped up indignantly. "Come on, you two. Aren't you going to help me?" Throughout the book, Dicks plays up the Doctor's alien nature. In this story, the Doctor hypnotizes two characters, engages in a telekinetic battle of wits with the Great Intelligence, and is frequently described as having immense strength under his unassuming, baggy exterior. Dicks clearly has a lot of fondness for both the Second Doctor and for Troughton, and it shows. But while in the book, It's amusing to read about the Doctor ransacking a treasure chest inside the TARDIS console room, searching for the holy Ganta of Tibet's Dead Set Monastery that still pales somewhat in comparison to the TV episodes where Troughton does even more impish clowning around the console room set, including some business with a set of bagpipes that Jamie then offers to tune for him. In episode 2, two inspired bits of clowning on the TV screen, the Doctor playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in his monastery cell, and then frightfully grabbing Victoria's hand because, oh no, Jamie has an idea, are both missing from the book. Instead, here, the Doctor sleeps in his monastery cell, relaxed, with something of the serenity of the Holy Ones themselves about it. Not that Troughton's performance could really be described as serene, and makes no comical double takes about Jamie's idea at all. The Doctor ends episode 6 by playing the recorder again, but the book is a recorder-free zone. Also missing from the adaptation is a rather striking scene in episode 4, when presumably added by assistant script editor Victor Pemberton late in the production, where Victoria and one of the Tibetan monks, played by David Spencer, who was Pemberton's partner, discuss the Doctor's great age and godlike qualities. In short, Dicks does an excellent job introducing the second Doctor to the novelization range. His Doctor is both clownish and alien, excitable and reflective, impish and hypnotic. It's only that, when you watch the TV episodes, you realize that Patrick Troughton was all of that, and about twice as much more besides. After the break, we'll talk about how Dicks handles the rest of the story elements, and we'll talk a little more about Henry Lincoln's rather more infamous second career after Doctor Who.
I wish the doctor would come back.
It's Doctor, is he your guardian?
I suppose he is in a way.
He is a good man.
I think so.
Tell me, Miss Victoria, how did he come by our holy bell?
I don't really know. Well, why?
It disappeared 300 years ago.
Oh, stolen.
No, it was given to a stranger for safekeeping during a time of trouble. It was never returned.
Stranger? Of course, the doctor. They're one and the same man.
But 300 years?
Oh, dear. Well, I know this sounds silly, but the doctor can travel through time and space. He has a machine, you see, and well, I don't really understand it myself, so it's rather difficult to explain.
There is no need, I understand perfectly.
You do?
Yes. You see, it is said that our master, Padmasambhava, can free himself from his earthly body and travel great distances.
Oh.
But this can only be attained after many years of strict discipline and self-training.
You mean that you might be able to do that sort of thing?
Perhaps, one day.
And I apologize for the audio quality of that excerpt, but that was the best material that I could find. The forthcoming animation of the Abominable Snowmen, which we alluded to at the top of the hour, is not due out, certainly here in the States, for quite some time, so I do not yet have access to a cleanly remastered version of the episode audio. I only recently learned that Henry Lincoln, co-writer of The Abominable Snowmen on TV, is the same pseudo-historian who co-wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail, i.e. one of the books that launched Dan Brown's truly regrettable career. Working in part from Lincoln's allegedly nonfiction book, Brown authored the Da Vinci Code, which put him into the pop culture stratosphere for a bit and resulted in a series of fairly disappointing Tom Hanks movies. Terrance Dicks' novelization of The Abominable Snowmen is a much better work than anything Dan Brown has written, even though it doesn't reveal any biblical truths or uncover any lost, let's say, Buddhist texts. It does lack some of the dense and richly detailed flavor that we previously talked about with his first two Target adaptations, Auton Invasion and Day of the Daleks, but it's still a good deal more longer and detailed than what's to come over the coming years when Terrance was writing 8 books every 12 months, including his slim adaptations of later-day Tom Baker episodes, books that would barely weigh in at 100 pages each. This is, for example, the first Dicks novelization not to feature a prologue with original material, such as a flashback to the war games or a long flash forward to life on dystopian, Dalek-conquered 22nd century Earth. It's also a 12-chapter book, with the cliffhangers to the first 4 episodes falling neatly at the ends of chapters 2, 4, 6, and 8. This is the origin, then, of Dix's soon-to-be standard 12-chapter potboilers. There's no real substantial backstory added for any of the characters, especially the Tibetan monks. The book opens, as does the TV, with a Yeti attacking Professor Travers' base camp and killing Travers' companion, and Dix does preface this with a few extra paragraphs of Travers having a nightmare that bleeds into his companion's death screams. But there's not a whole lot much more in terms of history or motivation, especially when it comes to a Krishong or a Tomni. We never learn how they joined the monastery, or who they were before they came to Detsen, or what their lives were like immediately before the Yeti descended on the mountain. What Dix does add, though, instead of Malcolm Hulk style backstory to each of the characters and short story like interludes, is atmosphere. The Abominable Snowmen, in spite of director Gerald Blake's best efforts, and the fact that at the moment we can only see live video for one of the 6 episodes, is affected by a couple of production choices. First, the team famously went to Wales for extensive location shooting to stand in for the Himalayas in early September, i.e., the summer of 1967. What they wound up with was a lot of rainy mud, but absolutely no snow. So the TV story takes place in the snowy Himalayan peaks of Tibet, but has not a single snowflake to show for it. Then, while the Yeti were supposed to be horrific, scary monsters, the end result were the rotund and adorable teddy bears. Cutie pies, if you will. In adapting a story set in rainy but snow-free Wales, and featuring cute and cuddly monsters, if you will, Dix at least is not bound by the TV production. Rather, he adapts the original Haseman and Lincoln scripts, which it turns out were quite a bit substantially different from what wound up on TV. Snow is still on the agenda, and the monsters can still be scary rather than huggable. Hence, Dix fires off a lot of appealing prose describing snowy mountain peaks or terrifying beasts. He writes, "The moon kept drifting in and out of black clouds, so that they were alternately plunged in pitch darkness or bathed in sinister, ghostly moonlight. Their footsteps sounded very loud as they crunched through the frozen snow." Later on, the Doctor admires a beautiful and spectacular sight to see, the sun rising over the snow-covered peaks. If only. As far as the Yeti themselves go, Dix writes, Jamie studied the creature cautiously, fascinated by his first clear look at a Yeti. It was massive, about 7 or 8 feet tall, Jamie guessed, and covered in shaggy brown fur. The powerful body was immensely broad, so that the thing seemed somehow squat and lumpy, in spite of its great height. The huge hairy hands and the black snout were gorilla-like. The little red eyes and the yellow fangs were like those of a bear. He remembered Victoria's description, something between a bear, an ape, and a man. All in all, thought Jamie, it was the biggest, nastiest, hairiest beastie he had ever seen. This passage reminds us of 2 salient points. A, that the Yeti were supposed to be much more frightening and otherworldly than the TV serial's portrayal of Zoftig Teddy Ruxpins, and B, that Jamie, in case you missed it, is Scottish. The opportunity is also taken to make Detsen Monastery large and intimidating, a character in the story itself. The Abominable Snowmen, as Doctor Who was back in the day, was recorded in Lime Grove D, Doctor Who's original home and its tiniest studio. Smaller on the inside, as Waris Hussein lamented in An Adventure in Space and Time in 2013. Dix uses the broader canvas to show us what we were forced to miss on TV. He says, but still, this mysterious silence and emptiness. The Detsen Monastery had always buzzed like a beehive, the chatter of pilgrims, the cries of peddlers in the courtyard, the low humming of the temple bells, the endless drone of monks at their prayers. It had been a lively, bustling place. Now, it was as quiet as a tomb. The Doctor shivered. Victoria also comments more than once on how Detsen is a rabbit warren, or how all the corridors look alike. Doctor Who's favorite cover explanation for filming the same single corridor from 7 different angles in Lime Grove D, or later in TC4. The base under siege format, so prevalent in the Troughton years, was a storytelling device used to make the most of a Lime Grove D-sized studio. But in the book, the monastery's great hall was filled with long tables and benches, enough to hold hundreds of monks when they gathered for food and prayer. The action scenes are much more vivid, too. Remember that Terrance is novelizing the Haseman and Lincoln scripts, not the televised action. So Jamie doesn't just beat a Yeti into unconsciousness. It's hoisted high up in the monastery wall by a net, and then breaks through the net and crashes to the ground. Krishong isn't just attacked by a Yeti. He's lifted up into the air like a rag doll and tossed like a small child. The Yeti causes warrior monks to bleed, and when they finally invade the monastery for good, the Yeti destroy all the food and fuel supplies by pouring them onto one unusable pile. The Doctor's final telekinetic battle with the intelligence features lamps flaring up in a sheet of flame, or whizzing through the air like a cannonball, although to be fair, the loose cannon team does feature gently floating torches in an effort to animate the remaining material. I also love to pay careful attention to Terrance's use of language, his near-perfect economizing of words. His trademark favorite descriptors, like strange, terrible, or savage, are all used here, although he has less opportunity to use gleaming, another time-worn favorite, in a story set in a dingy monastery in the distant past. Chapter 1 ends with the Doctor finding Travers's dead companion in the snow, quote, his neck broken by a single savage blow. Dicks also, as he'll do a lot, twice in this book alone, reminds us that Padmasambhava's voice came from nowhere, and yet from everywhere in the room. And another monk speaks with such authority that makes others fall silent. Padmasambhava, by the way, like many other Terrance characters over the years, sank back on the golden throne in infinite weariness, when he's not, while possessed by the great intelligence, cackling with hellish cosmic laughter. What Dicks prefers, even more so, words like strange or savage, are adjective pairs. Krishong fights a gallant and useless battle against the Yeti in episode 4, several pages before he is described as baffled and frustrated. The great intelligence is his physical manifestation on Earth, a fiery colored gel in the novelization, but probably just the output of that foam-making machine on TV again, is a bubbling, glutinous substance. When Travers collapses in exhaustion after some stupid and foolhardy side quest, he makes a tattered scarecrow figure. This is after he tumbles down the mountain like a falling boulder, which is a neat little simile. Padmasambhava, by the way, is truly grotesque. Dicks writes, the face was quite incredible, completely hairless, with huge forehead, sunken cheeks, and bony jaw. In contrast to the wizened face and shrunken body, the eyes were huge and dark and alive, shining with the blaze of an almost superhuman intelligence. The master Padmasambhava had indeed gone beyond the flesh. His body was merely the worn-out husk which barely contained his soul and spirit. Another feature for which the novelization is remembered is the renaming of all the Tibetan characters. As Doctor Who's outgoing producer at the time this book went out for publication, Letts had some degree of control over the novelization line and instructed Dicks to change the names. Haseman and Lincoln had used real Tibetan Buddhist names, and Letts thought that would be potentially offensive. So Padmasambhava becomes Padmasambhava, Songtsen becomes Songtsen, Tonmi becomes Tomni, and Ralpachan becomes Rapalchan, although there's not much of Rapalchan in the book, as John and I will talk about in the second half of this episode. Now, of course, there is one elephant in the room. Here's how Terrance describes the Tibetans. These were lamas, the priests of Detsen Monastery, whose lives were spent in peaceful meditation and prayer. Despite their gentle and unworldly manner, they had a sort of spiritual strength, a kind of gentle obstinacy that never failed to infuriate Krishong. One would have hoped for a lot of authentic Buddhist detail in the novelization, which Dicks would have picked up from Letts, a practicing Buddhist himself. The Abominable Snowmen was that rare Doctor Who serial set in Asia, with only one Western character in the guest cast, but it was, as was standard casting practice at the BBC in 1967, populated entirely by white guys from Great Britain. But even if the casting had been more enlightened, Haseman and Lincoln still had the characters speak mostly in fortune cookie riddles about Satan's hidden armor, or harsh words are like blunted arrows. It takes the truth to make them sharp. Their portrayal takes on the faint whiff of being condescending. After reaching the Dominators in the TARDIS Eruditorum series, Elizabeth Sandifer notes that the author's regressive attitudes on the planet Dulcus made you call into question everything that you thought was progressive about their earlier work. Terrance doesn't really make the source material less condescending, although back in 1974 he might not have been able to see the issues with the whitewashing in the script and the bad use of Asian accents and the portrayal of the monks on TV as antagonists. Now, Dicks does what he can. He includes several explanations, either never added to the original script or cut for timing, about why Chrysong formed a team of warrior monks or why Detsen is so underpopulated. It's because all the other monks were sent away for safety after the Yeti turned hostile. Dicks also gives us the menu: scalding Tibetan tea, a pile of yellow rice covered with strange meats and vegetables, and milkless unsweetened tea with yak butter floating in it, which nauseates Victoria. Although, as a side note, I don't think any character in any Dicks novelization ever quite enjoys their cup of tea. You can measure the gravity of a situation by just how bad the tea gets. Also, as John and I will talk about in a few moments, the worst tendencies of the monks on TV are smoothed over for the novelization, and many of the monks reduced in importance. So the worst parts of the Haseman and Lincoln script are fortunately not in the book, and if you came to the book first, you might not even know about them. So Dicks is making the Detsen characters as lifelike as he can, but absent any 20 extra pages of text or POV scenes from the monks, the only narrator here from the monk's point of view is Tomney. Fortune cookies most of the monks remain. Missing are two moments added in by the script editors, Bryant and Pemberton, during production. Chrysong on TV is given some final words before dying, and then there's that scene with Victoria and Tomney discussing the Doctor's agelessness. One advantage to the novelization line is that you lose the flavor of some of the actors' more inventive and improvisational TV performances, or the moments of heart or charm added at the last minute to an underrunning script. But in the end, Dicks adds enough of his own flavor to this novelization to make it one of his stronger efforts, and in my mind, far preferable to the TV serial, even when the animated version comes out. Coming up after the break, my interview with Doctor Who novelist Jonathan Blum. This interview was recorded on Tuesday. This was recorded before the news, if that's what it is, broke that BBC America will no longer be funding the animated Doctor Who reconstructions. We do talk a bit about the animated reconstruction and many other topics regarding Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen. And we're back now, and my very special guest today is the longtime Doctor Who novelist Jonathan Blum. John, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's great to be here.
So John and I go way back. I joined Rec Art's Doctor Who, the Wild West frontier of Doctor Who fandom, probably in the spring of 1992 when John was one of the top guns posting. And it quickly became apparent that John and I did not share a single opinion in common on any Doctor Who story ever. So naturally, we became pretty fast friends after that, and I spent a day, because he and I lived about 45 minutes apart at the time, and I spent a day on his fan video set Time Rift, where you can see my hand in action as a disembodied extra, I think in part 3.
Yeah, I think we got an over-the-shoulder shot of you back there, so you get a bit of chin acting in there as well, I think.
I think my chin acting was probably much better than my hand acting, but that was 30 years ago, so I'm sure my hand would do a much better job now if we were to do a Time Rift for the 13th Doctor rather than the 7th.
Oh, dear God, I'm sorry, the stripes wouldn't work for me, I have to say.
You look much better in the Sylvester McCoy jumper than you would in Jodie's striped shirt, probably.
Yes, thank you.
not to mention the culottes. So, John, you and I are roughly the same age, and we both come from the northeast ish corridor of the United States.
Hmm.
How long have you been a Doctor Who fan?
Since I think it was either late 1981 or early 1982, so I would have been about 10 years old when this is going down, and I discovered it on PBS back in those days on Channel 26 with the endless repeats of the first four seasons of Tom Baker, and I adored the show from the beginning there. And I remember being absolutely floored when I discovered my first Doctor Who book, which was Terror of the Zygons. And at the time, I had just seen this book, The Loch Ness Monster. I hadn't seen Terror of the Zygons on TV. So when the title sequence came up, Terror of the Zygons, I thought, great, another Zygon story.
Ha!
And a few minutes later, the truth came to me, and I don't think I actually did any kind of comparison between the book and the TV version at the time, but it is really interesting, as I've found out since then, to sort of look at how much things have been changed and fiddled with since then. When I was looking through it and comparing it with the transcript, I was actually really struck by the fact that there's almost no line of dialogue in that which Terrance hasn't tinkered with in some way. Just to rephrase it, whether it's to bring across more character on the page than is written in the plain lines, or in the case of the Doctor, I suspect because what Pat Troughton was delivering at any given moment was just an approximation of what was originally being said in the script. So,
Pat was very much into improv and giving the sense of the script rather than the actual literal word, right?
yeah. And in this case here, it's like I don't know how much of what we're seeing in this novelization is Terrance rewriting the script, and how much was him unrewriting Troughton's rewrites. I'd really love to know that at some point, because it's fascinating seeing the different styles at work there. What's interesting also for what you just said before about how you saw most of the Tom Baker stories after you'd read the books, that was my experience of the Peter Davison stories, because I had just started getting the novelizations for things that were coming out at the time, the absolutely newest ones like Castrovalva and so forth, before before the episodes ever got picked up in the Washington area. So we had a brilliant experience there of reading these books first and then seeing how they had been interpreted on TV from that the sort of what seemed in many cases to be the bare bones of the novelization being fleshed out on TV, as opposed to the other way around.
It's interesting with the Peter Davison stories too, because you have an author like Terrance Dudley who will go in and he will drastically rewrite the TV episodes for the book. So if you read Black Orchid, but especially King's Demons,
Yeah,
the endings of the books are radically different than what we got on television.
yeah. I really think a lot of it comes down to how much space you have, because it was, I think, during the time when they were putting out the Davidson novelizations when they increased the word count. And especially in Terrance Dudley's case, when you're novelizing a two-parter, you've got a lot of room to let things breathe and expand on them and flesh them out. Whereas the reverse was the case in a lot of the stories that Terrance novelized, both in the Fifth Doctor stuff and in earlier ones, where he basically is trying to squeeze everything down into a very limited word count there. And in fact, I think Abominable Snowmen is really the birth of that approach there when it comes down to the um uh, the pacing and so forth. Because up till then, I mean, Terrance's first couple of books are all like 35 to 40,000 words, so they were far longer than the later like 20 to 25,000 ones that we would be getting later on there. And even in those cases, before Abominable Snowmen, his first two books are are 40,000 words for a four-parter, so that's 10,000 words per episode. And then I think it's like 36 or something like that for Day of the Daleks, also a four-parter. So again, he's able to spend 9 to 10,000 words on each episode. Now suddenly he does Abominable Snowmen, and he suddenly has to do a six-parter and squeeze it into about the same length. I think the book's like 34,000 words according to the website I looked at. So suddenly, for the first time in his Doctor Who career, Terrance Dicks actually has to work on making a story shorter and tighter. And I think that's the birth of a lot of what we then see later on as the Terrance Dicks formula approach and so forth. Where he has stripped things down and focused them and includes only the bare minimum of really evocative details to try to sketch things off as concisely as possible. So it's bizarre reading this book for the first time in that context.
That's a really good point. You're right. This is only his, because on this show we're going in publication order. So I've already devoted episodes to the Auton Invasion, which was episode 4, and then Day of the Daleks, I think episode 7. But you're right, those were both 4-part stories where he was the script editor. Now, he did work on Troughton's final season, season 6, but Abominable Snowmen would have been written and rehearsed and recorded and erased before he got hired by the show. So this is the first time where he's writing a book where he has no nexus to the TV story at all. And like you say, he's writing a shorter book for a longer episode. So he has to make a lot of interesting editorial choices. And we'll talk about those editorial choices over the balance of this interview. But just to backtrack to your fandom, when did you first get to see the Troughton episodes on TV? And then what's your first memory of owning or reading this particular book?
Okay, that's a very good question. I know when the Troughton episodes first aired, or at least the few Troughton episodes that we got in the U.S. at the time, because they only had a package of the half dozen or so complete stories. That would have been early 1986, I think. Around that time, Maryland Public Television, who were absolute godsends, had basically followed up their first purchase of the Peter Davison and Colin Baker episodes by going back and picking up the entire Hartnell Troughton Pertwee run. So there's basically a 2-year period where I cycled through the entirety of Doctor Who in continuous order, or at least as much of it as existed at that point there. So we got to see our half dozen Troughton stories, beginning with the Dominators, and that was the first glimpse that we had of Pat in action. Again, by then I had a bunch of novelizations in my clutches at that point, but there were still a lot of things. I mean, I wasn't really cross-checking the two against each other or being retentive about it, but did have a real sense even then that Pat Troughton was definitely bringing stuff that you didn't expect to the Doctor. He seemed, but to me at the time, significantly more like the Doctors I knew than Hartnell was. Hartnell was a real departure from it, but with Troughton, there's a performance where it looks more familiar, but then you suddenly realize later on down the line that no, he's inventing all this as he goes.
Right. It's interesting when you talk about Troughton because he was kind of an agent of chaos on set because, he was memorizing the impressions of the script, but not the dialogue word for word. And he did a tremendous amount of nonverbal acting.
Mm.
Whereas Hartnell was also doing a lot of nonverbal acting to make sure that his hands were at center stage. And in his case, especially in the later years, he just wasn't, able to memorize the script. So he would often go off on tangents or long pauses. So different approaches. But I'm similar to you in that we got the Hartnell package on Channel 21 in late 1985. So they were showing one complete serial with cliffhangers every Saturday night. So they had 17 of the Hartnell serials, and then all they had were 5 of the Troughtons, all from season 6. So it was Dominators, Mind Robber, the Crotons, the Seeds of Death, and then the War Games, which they usually spread out over 2 weeks, 5 and 5.
Did you actually get them as episodes? Because we got them in movie format.
Channel 21 broadcast them as episodes.
Oh,
So
cool.
they would show all 5 in a row, back to back to back to back. So we had other PBS stations, like we had access to New Jersey Network, which did them in movie format. So I probably saw them on New Jersey Network first. So I would see, the Dominators or the Mind Robber in movie format. And then later on, Channel 21, they kept the cliffhangers. So I had, each individual episode. And once they were on VHS, I could watch them one a night rather than all 5 in one go.
Yeah, that's really neat because my first exposure, as I said, was movie format. So for the longest time, I didn't really get cliffhangers in the early stories. I could sort of guesstimate where they were from where we were in the story, but I didn't get that regular rhythm of the chapter break in effect. My analogy that I'd probably come up with this is that Abominable Snowmen is to the books what the War Machines is to the TV show. It's the point where it's the first glimpse of a formula that will eventually come to dominate a few years worth of the series in the future, but it's not quite there yet. Actually, I suppose in a way that's what Abominable Snowmen is on the TV show as well, in that it's got the seeds of stuff that will become huge in Terrance's time. I mean, this will eventually lead to, by the sequel, the Brigadier and the beginning of the unit format. But none of that's actually in the book yet, so there's only that sort of retrospective connection to where it will all end up.
I do remember with the Web of Fear, you're actually the one who told me this on Records Doctor Who years ago. Because in the Web of Fear, there was the scene where the Doctor meets the Brigadier for the first time, and Terrance signposted as a very, very important moment. and I posted on RecArts that I wanted to watch that scene, and you were the one who broke it to me that that was the week that Pat was on vacation in Web of Fear, and that scene didn't exist.
Oh dear. Sorry, disillusioning you at such a young age.
But of course, Terrance writes it so well that it almost doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, no way on television, because they didn't even realize the Brigadier was going to be a regular at that point. Uh, there's no way that any written scene in Web of Fear could have matched what Terrance later gave us in the book.
Yeah, I think that hindsight is playing into Abominable Snowmen too. In fact, to some degree, I mean, he doesn't make any explicit references to later on, but there is this sense here that even though this is slightly before his era on the show, I mean, his first story as like the assistant script editor was Web of Fear, but he has that connection because he was around for Web of Fear. He sort of knows these events are going to be significant down the line. I think that informs his focus of the story to an extent. There, it's interesting because I mean, when you think about it, this sorry to go off on a tangent here about the book in particular, but it's a very odd book to choose to begin doing not just Second Doctor stories, but out of Doctor stories in general. I mean, if you were going to, if you wanted to say, right, you're going to do your first Pat Troughton novelization, you want to introduce this Doctor to it, why is it not a Cyberman book or even an Ice Warrior book? Why the Abominable Snowmen, who are basically everyone's, I guess, fourth or fifth favorite monster for the most part? Why would this be the launching point? And I think that I did a little research, and I can't really be sure about this, but I think it's literally a case of they'd approached Jerry Davis, but he couldn't deliver his book as quickly. So that might be what's going on there. But you have this real sense that that Terrance Dicks is having to reintroduce the whole idea of doing a past Doctor story. In fact, this is the first real past Doctor story. Up till this point, all the novelizations have been, when they are first published, they are the current Doctor, and in fact, in some senses they're presented like they're a continuing series. I mean, when you look at the novelizations for the first few Third Doctor stories, they're about as much a continuing series as the Hardy Boys books or something. I mean, you get the first one, which introduces which introduces the exile to Earth and Liz Shaw and sets up the whole series. Then you've got Cave Monsters, which continues on that. Then you get Colony in Space, which is turned into Doomsday Weapon, which serves in book terms to replace Liz with Joe. Again, continuing the series. Get Day of the Daleks building on what we saw in Colony in Space with the Doctor still working on the TARDIS. The demon. I mean, then the demons following up on the Master, getting him arrested, which is then picked up on Sea Devils. It is a continuing series of books up to this point. And now suddenly they've decided they've changed the emphasis. They're going to do not just the continuing story of Doctor Who in book form. They're going to start jumping around through the entire history of the series. And this is the beginning of that. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why they chose to suddenly start making this a mixture of new and past Doctor stories from then on in the novelizations. I think it might be because this is 1974 and they basically realized, oh dear, we can't keep cranking out John Pertwee stories and have when Tom Baker is the Doctor, we're going to have to start a much looser approach there. But again, I don't have anything that says for sure about why they decided at this point, right, this is where we're going to start doing past Doctors.
That answer may be in David J. Howe's Target book, which I have, but I haven't read that in a few years. But you're right, looking at the upcoming schedule, this is basically book number 10, because they started off by reprinting the 3 Frederick Muller books, which was all Hartnell, and then the next 6, like you say, Hardy Boys style, form a sort of continuity. In the Hardy Boys, of course, they didn't have footnotes, but they would always say, the previous adventure was, the Tower Treasure, and then at the end of the second book, they would say, they didn't know it at the time, but they were about to have the dastardly adventure of the Secret of the Caves.
Yeah, basically like Hartnell style cliffhangers, just tacking on a little thing to throw you to the next story.
Right, so here, this is book 10. It's the first Second Doctor book. Book 12 is going to be the novelization of the Moon Base, so that's going to go even further back in time with Troughton and introduce Ben and Polly. The Moon Base, by the way, was my first novelization, so stay tuned for episode 12 where I break that down in obsessive detail. Then, after the Moon Base, the very next book is the first Tom Baker novelization, Doctor Who and the Giant Robot. Then we go back to Terror of the Autons, which is Joe's proper origin story. So Joe's going to get 2 origin stories in the span of 9 books. And then after that, they're going to toggle back and forth between 3 and 4. Before book 20 is The 10th Planet, which is the first Hartnell novelization since 1965. So you're right, this is the moment where they break the continuity and just go off and start doing their own thing. So on the other half of this recording, I've already talked about the way that Terrance is starting to work on his boilerplate descriptions of the Second Doctor and the way that he's writing Jamie heavily in dialect. And I think it's probably one of the few times that he writes for Victoria, and he has his descriptions of her, which are a little longer than we get later on by the time he novelizes something like The Web of Fear. So, on the other half of this episode, I've talked about his prose style when he's introducing these now long ago characters who haven't been seen on television in 8 years. But in addition to introducing the Second Doctor and Jamie and Victoria to an audience of young readers, some of whom might not have been born when Fury from the Deep aired, and almost certainly not when Evil of the Daleks, which introduced Victoria, aired. What else is Terrance doing to the televised version of Abominable Snowmen to bring it down into book form? Because, like you say, he's dealing with a shorter word count. How does he change the TV serial to fit into this smaller book?
Well, it's interesting because he, besides introducing Jamie and Victoria at some length there, he also spends a lot of time introducing Professor Travers, who again is a character who will play into future stories there. But the amount of emphasis that he gets in terms of filling in his backstory and explaining the expedition that he's on in the first place is it's astonishing by the standards of later Terrance how much time and effort he puts into setting up backstory and background from the beginning. I mean, literally, when you pick up the book, the the first recognizable line of dialogue from the script doesn't come until page 10. The first chunk of pages in chapter one are all new material covering Travers's backstory or a dramatized retelling of that first scene where Travers's traveling companion gets killed. It's basically it is Terrance still just not just typing up the scenes from the TV script, but he is writing. He is treating this as the introduction of characters in a novel, and the faithfulness to the script that we would later see in these things is just not present. He is still writing this as if it's a book, like he does with the Day of the Daleks novelization. He's sort of reimagining this. Now, this doesn't last. I mean, he gets a lot closer to the script from there on after the introduction, aside from, as I said, just tinkering with pretty much every line of dialogue. But this he has really, I think, put a real bit of thought into not just, I mean, how do I get through this in as tightly and as quickly as possible, not so much just the efficiency. He's been having to think about the characters and what they are doing and why they are doing it, which I think is absent in some of the later novelizations, which my friend Greg McElhatton once memorably described as novels while you wait. But here he's actually really crafting this here. The material that struck me the most is that he has thought about the roles of the various monks there. I suspect we'll probably talk a bit more about the questions of race and so forth in this later on here, but I think that he's really tried to have a think about the personalities of the monks and how to make them possibly a little more complex or a little more interesting than they would have been in just a straight retyping of the script. The big one that jumps out for me is Rinchen. Now, what I didn't know until very recently, like basically just these past few months when I listened to the Abominable Snowmen audio and then read the transcript, is that the role of Rinchen in the TV version is much more of an antagonist. He gets a lot of the lines where he's suspicious of the Doctor and of this devil woman Victoria, and and generally takes a role of being one of the ones who is leading the suspicions of these outsiders. Whereas in the book, a lot of that material gets transferred to Crisson. They really are playing up at this point. I think Terrance has decided to make the central sort of character conflict within the monks being Crisson being torn between his warrior like desire to protect the monks and his actual sense of being comparatively sensible. So you get material that on that in the TV episode is quite straightforward. Um, if you look at it, a specific example I can give you actually is partway through episode 4. Um, the cliffhanger to episode 3, which I'll talk about a little later on in terms of rethinking, is is basically the Victoria finding the Yeti, and the Yeti comes to life, and there's a whole rampage, and then eventually they open the gates, and the Yeti leaves, and everyone else is left to pick up the pieces. On screen, the subsequent scene is between Crisong, Tomney, Victoria, and Rinchen, in which Crisong starts upbraiding Tomney about how you deliberately disobeyed my orders. Victoria tries to stand up for Tomney and says, "Anyway, it was my idea to open the gates." And Rinchen seizes on this, accuses her of it also being her idea to breathe life into the Yeti, and interrogating her, um, basically pursuing Victoria and generally being aggressively suspicious of her throughout. Crisong then falls into line behind Rinchen, and this ends with Rinchen basically pushing Crisong into locking Tomney and Victoria up. Yeah, it has a line about "Where is your authority, Crisong? Let your warriors forget their allegiance." So Rinchen is quite aggressively suspicious of these mysterious interlopers in the TV version. When you get to that scene in the book, Rinchen isn't there. It is entirely Crisong, having been overwhelmed by this recent attack there, uh, ter- interrogating Tomney, and then when Victoria comes to Tomney's defense, he's the one who says that who starts interrogating her. So they have given the suspicions to Crisong, but also then play up later on his turnaround in trusting them more. So this is Terrance actually rethinking the characters of the script as they go, not just the plot beats, but he's really trying to make the characters, I think, more complex, because you get Crisong being based at both the suspicious one and the practical one, who eventually realizes that the Doctor and company are right, and this sort of comes to a head when Crisong finally gets killed. It becomes the end of a journey for the character. I'm very impressed by what Terrance has done in terms of just shifting the balance and making the character work more interesting. It's less interesting for Rinchen, who basically becomes part of a double act with Sapan, but Crisong gets much more dimension in this telling.
You're right. From a storytelling standpoint, Rinchen doesn't have a role to play in the finale on television. He's one of a group of characters who leave the monastery, uh, probably late episode 5 or early episode 6.
Actually, wait, I think you might be confusing Rinchen with Rapalchan.
Rapalchan, who on TV is Ralpachan, is the one who was played by David Barron, who was not Harold Pinter's pseudonym.
Yeah.
But Ralpachan has a huge role to play in the finale on television, coming out of nowhere to become a major character in episode 6. And as you pointed out to me when we were corresponding to record this episode, he's not on the end of the book either.
Yeah, what happens with Rapalchan is another bit of I think giving more material to the main characters. Rapalchan, who is he's present earlier on, but he's basically an anonymous sentry. In the book, I think he's referred to once by name. Otherwise, he's just the sentry in the few scenes he's in. And then in episode 6, the subplot in 6 involves basically Travers and Rapalchan going up the mountain to try to stop the problem at the source at the cave, and basically being defeated. They can't get there, and it serves largely to keep not just Rapalchan but Travers away from the immediate final action, which is being done by Jamie and Tomney, until Travers can make a dramatic delayed entrance at the end there. But what Terrance, I think, has done is worked out that all these scenes with Travers work at least as well, and possibly more dramatically, if he makes his mission to the cave a solo mission. He doesn't bring Rapalchan along. Rapalchan's main purpose in those scenes there, what he actually is there for, I suspect, in the script version, is to give Travers someone to talk to. But Terrance realizes he can bring across everything Travers sees as internal monologue, and writes the scenes from his point of view, and it becomes Travers on this daring solo mission where he could quite easily get killed, and then having to realize that it is all for nothing and trying to hurry back to the monastery. Again, it gives character beats and material to the central characters while sort of paring back the other ones there. And I don't know how much of this decision is guided by Travers being the character who then comes back for Web of Fear, which of course he would know from his own experiences. But it's definitely fascinating to just focus in on these viewpoint characters more strongly.
All right, so let's talk about that for a few moments then. So turning back to Rinchen, as we were saying, he disappears and he's not in the climax on TV, whereas Krishong is the person who basically dies as kind of like a sacrifice so that the others might live. So from a storytelling point of view, it's more interesting to focus on the character who has this journey going from suspicious of the Doctor to dying in service of the Doctor to help save the day. Since Rinchen is not going to be in the climax, he doesn't need to be as big an antagonist in the book, since in the end run he doesn't matter. So that's why Rinchen gets minimized in the book. And like you say, on television, you need to have a second body for the actor to talk to. Otherwise, you have long, endless scenes of Travers running around by himself on location. And giving him David Barron, who again is not Harold Pinter, fills up the screen time and makes the action more visually dynamic. And then, of course, they went and junked the video, so we can't watch this at all. So it goes back to being static and dull as a recon, which hopefully will be changed when they bring us the animated version in a few more months.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see this animated. Yeah.
And I have some questions for you about that, but we'll come back to that in a few moments. So, continuing on this theme of the end of the book being turned into Travers having a hero's journey, going to the caves by himself and then coming back to be a dramatic entry to save the day in the monastery, Terrance does something similar in the first 2 pages, which serve as a prologue inside of Chapter 1, because he narrates for us Travers' internal thoughts about his mission failure, and he has bad dreams, people are laughing at him, and that bleeds into the sound of his fellow explorer getting killed by the Yeti. And when I first heard the audio of Part 1, probably a decade after I read the book, I was really upset that that stuff wasn't on TV, because Terrance brought it to life so vividly. I was expecting to see flashbacks and hearing people laughing at Travers and him waking up and hearing the screams. No, none of that.
Yeah, it's cinematic, which is an impressive thing, I think, for Terrance to be adding in book form. I mean, it's like one of those cases where he has decided, I think, who this book is about. And there are a few characters who I think become the viewpoint characters. Travers is the obvious choice from the beginning. But this character who is this just suspicious, obsessive figure in the book, or rather in the TV version and the transcripts there, becomes this sympathetic. Even though he is raw, he is clearly wrong and deluded. There's sympathy for this character in a way which really fleshes him out, and I think this is Terrance writing rather than typing, and I'm very impressed by his by everything that I'm seeing that he has fleshed out Travers' journey there. And the other thing that I'm just very impressed by is that he managed to do all this while slimming the action down. If I can jump back, there was one thing that I meant to get to that I just realized I didn't talk about in the in terms of the script editing and plot simplification stuff that I mentioned. Can I go back to that for a second?
Sure.
I was again, I was talking about the material in episode 4, which is picking up from the episode 3 cliffhanger. The stuff before the episode 3 cliffhanger, Terrance has done a massive script editing job on like the last chunk of episode 3. There's an entire subplot with Victoria escaping from the cell that she's locked up in episode 3 before she and Tommy get locked up again in episode 4, and you can therefore see why there's why he's simplifying all this. Where Victoria gets out, all the various monks are running around looking for her, getting suspicious of her, wondering what this foreign devil child is up to, etc. And she finds the inner sanctum where Padmasambhava is hiding out there. Meets him, and he basically says you should not be here, child, and she leaves, and that's the end of that subplot. And it never actually pays off later on down the line that she has had this first encounter with Padmasambhava. And then she wanders off and finds the Yeti just at the exact moment when the sphere hops in, and the Yeti comes to life in time for the cliffhanger. Terrance looks at this, and he just sort of draws a big line straight through the whole thing. He takes that entire last chunk of episode 3 with Victoria's subplot, and reduces it to one or two lines after she escapes. Um, Bored with waiting in her room, she had decided to go and hunt for the mysterious inner sanctum. Almost immediately, she had become lost. She had long ago abandoned her plan to look for Padmasambhava. And then he goes straight to the cliffhanger scene. He has literally taken what Terrance, as a script editor, is somewhat famous for, the plot loop, the subplot of action that leads you back basically where you started, and just lopped that out completely. I mean, if you look at the War Games, which is Terrance on TV desperately trying to fill space, he and Matt Culp would talk about how they would have these loop plots, as he put them, which would have a lot of forward motion that would end up being for nothing and lead them back to where they started. So this is a trademark of his. It is his way of getting an episode up to 25 minutes. Now, for the first time in his Doctor Who career, Terrance Dicks is trying to make Doctor Who stories shorter and tighter, and this is what he will eventually become the theme of his novelizations there. And he has just been ruthless in terms of just paring that stuff back. Even better, though, when he gets to the cliffhanger, he changes it to pick up on something from episode. I think it's 5. No, it's also possibly part. It's either 4 or 5, where when Jamie is carrying one of the spheres and it starts trying to drag him over to the Yeti to insert the sphere, he makes it the cliffhanger so that instead of Victoria just happening to be there as the sphere connects with the Yeti and the Yeti comes to life, the sphere makes her pick up the sphere and put it in for her. That's a level of mind control that's more than what it does in the script, where it suggests there's more sort of a physical. This thing is just tugging you towards, and it's Jamie trying to hold on, which is just keeping it from just sort of going into the Yeti itself. Now it's actually controlling her into putting the sphere in place, which not only ups the threat level, it also then, in that later scene that I talked about, makes it more sensible why they suspect her, because she has to admit that, yeah, she put the sphere into the Yeti, but I didn't mean to. So he has managed to justify the plot logic. He has managed to streamline the action, and basically, I am so impressed. And the net result of all this, of seeing all these changes that he makes to the structure in getting the entirety of episode 3 down to 15 pages of book, and the character stuff that makes sense as a result of this. The main thing that I wish I could have seen this episode on TV as Terrance Dicks script edited it. Why couldn't he have started work on Doctor Who just a few months earlier and done this to the episodes themselves? That would have been a joy.
I remember them saying that they had to do all these 6-part serials in the 60s because they couldn't afford to do 4-part serials.
Oh yes.
You need the longer serials for budgeting reasons, but then of course you have to pad them out because most stories organically aren't going to have that much space in them. And that reaches the point of absurdity when 2 stories collapse and they have to make the War Games 10 weeks long because otherwise you're going to have 4 weeks of just airing the test pattern card.
Oh yes, and I can see entirely why they would bulk these things out, and why Terrance was known for the extra bits of padding. But the thing that struck me was that, I mean, I suspect that, I mean, if Terrance had been responsible for the script editing of this on TV, he would have come up with more interesting padding than what they got in that episode 3. He would have his plot loops tend to be a little more dynamic than not even corridor running in the case of Victoria. It's largely corridor walking, and and so I think he would have, even if he had to bulk the thing out, he would have come up with more interesting things to bulk it out with, and also that the attention that he gives to making the stuff, he enhanced the story in character terms, is something that would have really, I think worked well on the screen.
He also later comes up with the pretty genius idea of turning a 6-part story into a 4 and a 2. So for most of the second half of the Pertwee era, a 6-part story is going to take a wild dogleg at the end of episode 4. And that way, the Time Monster, instead of running around Cambridge, they go to Atlantis for 2 episodes. One of the major antagonists is killed off at the end of episode 4 of The Monster of Peladon, and you introduce a new antagonist for parts 4 and 5. Abominable Snowmen really doesn't have that dogleg. Terrance is still working with the old 6-part structure. It was just one story that drags out over 6 weeks on the same sets, and the only change is if they have to move into a smaller studio and maybe some of the sets disappear. But
Yeah.
you weren't doing the 6-part story with a dogleg halfway through like they would do later on during the Pertwee and for most of the few Tom Baker six-parters for sure.
Yeah, I think what you have also there is, I mean, specifically the reason why it's around the end of part four, or in the case of something like Seeds of Doom at the end of part two, is because of the shift in production methods, where suddenly instead of making one episode every week, they would make two episodes every 2 weeks. So you would have a different set of sets in the studio for episodes 3 and 4, and then episodes 5 and 6, and that you would have that sort of thing there. Whereas when you're trying to do a six-parter under the old format, you basically are have a limited number of sets for that episode for that week. Even so, I mean, I think that it's a very good point that Abominable Snowmen can't really have a journey from one location to another because it is all around a single location throughout. Now, my favorite bit of I think Terrance being able to smarten things up in terms of while keeping to one location, would probably be Inferno, where he basically is stuck with having it all be in one location, but with the parallel universe gambit, he manages to basically make all the sets wear a beard, and it feels like a completely different location while not requiring a whole another whole bunch of sets. And that is proper genius with on economy budgets there. So I can see how Terrance can do that. I can't picture what he would have done as a script editor to get an alternate location into something like this.
Well, the problem is, of course, like you say, they spent a week in Wales on location, filming up and down this decidedly unsnowy valley.
Mm.
And there's location footage in every episode. So there's really no way to dogleg the story because you always have to go back outside and show the lack of snow on the mountaintops.
Yeah, it's interesting that they. I mean, the amount of film in this story, that was another, at the time, I think, major innovation for Doctor Who. I mean, basically, instead of making one episode a week, they took when they came back from their very brief interseason break, they could do this extra week and a bit of filming, and then just basically make episodes. I think 1 and 2 were shot the same week because they just had so much film in those couple of episodes. So they're messing with the formula, but they're not messing with it enough, I think, to really make the TV version as dynamic as it could be. If they could find some way where there was where they were able to shift the central location from outside the monastery to inside partway through, and I mean, with the one episode a week thing, it wouldn't have to be at the end of episode 4. It could have been in episode at the end of episode 2, like if they'd been stuck with Travers facing the Yeti outside and then moved into the monastery for the last 4 episodes. They could have done something like that. But again, this is an even more radical reimagining than the book is.
The Abominable Snowmen is the story that would change Doctor Who forever, though, because they were working Patrick Troughton to the bone. He's filming 46 weeks a year. And then after he films in the studio Monday to Friday, he then has to go on location for the next story Saturday and Sunday. He wasn't
Mm.
getting any weekends. And this is a man who has two families in two different parts of England, so he certainly needs those weekends to himself.
Oh Lord, yes.
But he then goes to the producers and he says, "Look, we spent a week on location for Abominable Snowman. Why don't we do that in every story?" So season 6 is a shorter season, and they're doing a week of location followed by studio, and that way there's more time to breathe. And that gives a glossy look to a story like The Invasion, where there's certainly a lot of exteriors, the War Games, where there's a lot of exteriors. So, in that sense, The Abominable Snowman did a lot of good for Doctor Who because it forced along the visual evolution. It made them more economical with studio time. It gave them more location filming. So, that's how The Abominable Snowman was good for Doctor Who. So, that'll lead to the dogleg in this conversation. Let's talk about how The Abominable Snowman was bad for Doctor Who. And I'll give you my perspective first, then I'll ask for your perspective, and then we'll talk about the forthcoming animation, which none of us have seen yet because it hasn't been released. So I used to love The Abominable Snowman as a TV serial primarily because I loved the book. And I was imputing to the TV serial what I'd read in the book. The first time that I saw Abominable Snowman would have been when the Troughton Years VHS came out. I would have been in college. I probably bought that in 1993. And I would have watched the one orphan episode, episode 2, which, not a bad episode.
It's not bad, but I think it was around that time that my friends and I began to refer to it as the abominably slow man.
uh, well, again, you're talking about 1960s
Yep.
television language. It would
What
have
can I
been done.
say? We were bitchy back then.
So I watched The Abominable Snowmen in full probably several years after that when I had access to the recons. So now you have one live episode and 5 recons. And loose cannon, give them all the credit in the world. They do a great job of trying to bring these stories to life.
Yeah.
They will animate the candles, they will film special CGI footage of Yeti walking around. I think for Evil of the Daleks, they hired somebody as a stand in for Victoria to show Victoria wandering up and down the Maxtable house to pad out some of the interminable sequences in Evil of the Daleks.
Yeah, they have her being herded about by a Dalek and I think they shoot like Jamie's boots or something in a couple of bits to just to get some motion into it. They do incredible jobs in trying to bring these things to life.
It wasn't until last year, 2021, when I was doing my classic series pilgrimage. I ended up watching the entire series 2 parts a night in 13 months
This is
that
what
I
a friend of ours
realized
calls the Great Journey of Life.
the great journey of life. I can't really do the Clifford Norgate Nymon voice, but yes,
No.
if I could, I would dub that in. It wasn't until last year that I realized, and I credit Elizabeth Sandifer for this because I got the germ of that idea in her writings in Tardis Eruditorum, where she's taking a sledgehammer to the Dominators and saying everything that's bad about the Dominators makes you question everything you thought was good about Abominable Snowmen. I didn't realize how racist, and I use that term advisedly because in 1967 they probably wouldn't have been thinking along those lines. It's a terribly racist story in the way that it treats the monks. It doesn't want to tell a story about Buddhism. It does not want to pull a Barry Letts and talk about how this different tradition from another country can inform us and enrich our lives, which is the Barry Letts perspective, and that will speak to Planet of the Spiders years later. In terms of the Abominable Snowmen, the only reason the monks are there is because it has to be a story about the Yeti, so you have to film it in Tibet and you have to have monks. They would solve that problem for Web of Fear by bringing the Yeti to London. But Hazeman and Lincoln don't really have anything good to say about Buddhism, and most of the monks just become antagonists, speaking in terms that probably don't relate very well to the actual practice of Buddhism as Barry Letts would have done it, or as you and I would know it. So you have, Rinchen and Sapan as their double act, calling Victoria a she-devil for 5 straight weeks of television, which is not a very enlightened perspective. And then,
Hmm.
of course, you have some of the cast are using their own accents. Some of them are trying to do an Asian accent, and it sounds terrible. And then you have to get around the elephant in the room. It is all white guys who are playing the monks, which leads me to wonder when they do the animation. And I'm curious to get your perspective on this. Do you think they can take the liberty of recasting the roles so they can actually have Asian faces in the animation rather than white guys in bad makeup?
That's really interesting because I think on the one hand, I would be entirely happy if they animate the faces to look less like the actors and more like the characters would. I think that would be a very effective way to do it. But at the same time, though, you would still have people doing the Asian accent kind of thing in some of the cases that would perhaps make it it. I'm a little worried that no matter how they do it, it's going to be a bit like those dubbed episodes of Monkey, which are in some cases. I mean, Kate grew up watching Monkey, and it is in many ways brilliant and witty and clever, and had a wonderful line with a couple of characters deciding they're just going to attack that model village down there. But it's also at the same time you are very aware that this is that that rather than a reverential portrayal of Buddhist scripture, this is David Collings doing a funny voice as Monkey. And so I don't know whether reanimating it will be enough to fix the problem of the actual dialogue and the way and the actors who are delivering it there. I don't know whether that will work or not. I think that they're going to give it a very good try, though. I think they're going to have they're going to do their best because they from what I gather are aware of the issues and want to make it as respectable as possible. And I think that the novelization, as you were beginning to talk about, you're probably going to have more to say about this. So I don't want to preempt you here. The novelization, I think, does quite a bit to actually flesh this out with a more genuine appreciation of Buddhism, and a lot of this does come from Terrance's connection with Barry Letts. So I think there is there is that there is that ability to basically to take this story, and they've been working on it since the 1970s to redeem the rougher portions of it. Actually, come to think of it, I just this is a connection that I'm just making now, so this may be complete bullshit, and you may wish to chop this out of the interview entirely. But I was just thinking about this. Kate and I recently discovered, while rummaging through old TV services, through old film collections on I think it might have been Amazon, that we saw like the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road to films, and we got to see the Road to Hong Kong,
Oh
which
my
is
goodness.
yeah. Well, I have to say that I mean it is not aggressively racist, but Lord, is it tacky. It is just it's not it clearly does not have a vicious bone in its body, but it does not have an active cell in its brain either. So it stumbles into every possible cliche that you could come up with.
Do you agree with my take on Abominable Snowmen, or do you believe that Haseman and Lincoln are trying to do a more sensitive job with regard to actual Tibetan slash Buddhist culture?
It's an interesting question. I think again to paraphrase the discontinuity guide, its heart is in the right place, but its brain isn't. Like they're not trying to do a hatchet job, I don't think, but I do think that they are running on stereotypes to a significant extent. I mean, the xenophobia really of the monks and so forth is very uncomfortable, and it's one of the biggest things I think that that Terrance tones down. They are not just suspicious. I mean, they perhaps that's one of the reasons why he puts more of the suspicion on Crisong, because Crisong is suspicious not because they are outsiders, because this is a devil woman for the only woman in the cast, or any of that sort of stuff. That he's suspicious because of the very practical things and realistic things that have been happening, the Yeti attacks and so forth. He manages to ground this much less in a sort of generalized they are others, therefore they are hostile attitude, into something that is more practical and more grounded. The other thing that I think the novelization has done to try to ameliorate this, in fact, is that this is something that I remember hearing years ago, was something that Terrance got off of Barry Letts in this novelization. He has changed the spellings of the names.
Yes, and actually, on one of the DVD audio commentaries, or on one of the DVD special features, I believe Barry Letts speaks to that, because Haseman and Lincoln did a little bit of research and they used real names. Padmasambhava historically was a very important figure. He's known as the second Buddha. So the implication in the TV episode is that it's the same guy who's become evil, which is certainly not a good portrayal of who the historical Padmasambhava would have been.
Yeah, it would be like having an ancient historical villain named Moses. Really, is what it comes down to.
And we'll forgive Barry Letts for the line in the Demons novelization about Moses having horns, which is not original to the Demons. There's actually a statue of Moses in the Bronx with horns, which has led to terrible allegations against our people in the past.
Yeah, I remember that. That's one of those moments there where it's clearly I think Barry is significantly more aware of such things. There, and Terrance, I mean, for all Terrance Dicks' protestations of him being unreconstructed in so many ways, which he seemed to be quite enjoying being the grumpy old man of Doctor Who fandom at times. He I think was actually very sensitive when it came to racial matters. I mean, here and in the Web of Fear novelization, where he has de-Jewishized the Julius Silverstein character, and the Weng Chiang novelization, where he takes out a lot of the more uncomfortable stuff that Robert Holmes had put in the script there. I think he is quite aware and of how to basically just not blunder into really offensive stuff. And I mean, I know that Padmasambhava's name is actually spelled differently in the book. I think they leave out one of the A's. I'm trying to check that here. Yes, it's BVHA in the book and BVAAHA in the actual script, and indeed in the actual historical figure. And I think Songsten becoming Songtsen is similar. They shifted this just to give it a little bit of like, not blatantly in your face. If someone has actually Buddhist reads it, they will have the urge to fling the book across the room territory. So it's ironically enough the the changed names to give it some distance is the same trick that Salman Rushdie used in the Satanic Verses when he was doing some of the stuff that referred to Muhammad. He changed the name to make it not official, not clearly him, and that did not impress people there. But at least in these cases here, they tried.
And when Salman Rushdie talked about Doctor Who and the mutants in the Satanic Verses, he changed the plot around so it was unrecognizable.
Yeah, but of course, interesting there. He's looking again at TV, trying to deal with the ideas of the mutants as other, as in this case, mutasians is the way he was. I remember he put it there. So he's sort of playing with this from the other perspective of looking at that tendency of TV to treat these characters as other, as alien, as exoticized in some way or another. I think that I mean, if I think now they've said exoticized, that might actually be what Heisman and Lincoln are doing. They are not writing anything that's maliciously anti-Buddhist or anti-Asian in general there, but they are using this as exotic window dressing to a fair extent, and not really looking at the assumptions underneath what they're doing. Allow me to put in a quick mention here also of what some of the other writers have done with these characters. I mean, I'm Andy Frankham Allen over in the Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart books has, since of course he owns the rights to or controls the rights to the Heisman and Lincoln's estates. He is actually the literary executor of their estate there. He has actually done a follow up on this story, which basically one of the Brigadier novels gets into Padmasambhava's story and manages to sort of thread the needle between the idea of, okay, could this be the historical Padmasambhava, still having survived through the centuries? Is he? What is he actually? Yeah, if that's the case, then how do you manage to make this not a villainous portrayal or a pawn of evil portrayal? And what the book he actually plays with in the book, what he actually plays with. And I'm going on memories of this because I read this about 2 years ago, and my brain is now full of other stuff. But what he does in that case is comes with the idea that what Padmasambhava has actually been trying to do in this case with the Great Intelligence through this story and beyond is that what he is actually trying to do is trying to lead the Great Intelligence back to the light. Which
Ooh.
I thought that was a brilliant idea for how to make the character. I mean, they're still saying that this historic figure who is one of the founding lights of Buddhism could be fallible and could be overwhelmed at times, but the idea that this is still just part of a long game, for that is eventually trying to, in his hopes, redeem the Great Intelligence from it having lost its way. I thought that was a very sensitive and respectful reading of it. That I'll give full marks to Andy for that in terms of expanding on the story and making the uncomfortable stuff in the original work better.
That's amazing. I don't think I knew about that, and I'm gonna have to do a deep dive into that to give that a look. That sounds terrific. That would definitely help. It wouldn't make me like the Abominable Snowmen better, but it would help me come to better terms with the story.
Yeah, I mean it's an elegant bit of retconning, I think, and I mean I know that I have done work now for the Lethbridge Stewart book line. I know that Andy is very aware of the continuity and is very protective of trying to do the right thing by it there. I really can't speak for him because he clearly has plans and visions that I am not that I am not tuned into on these things here. But he seems to be very aware of the issues and want to treat the Buddhism in his stories, and by extension in the original story, respectfully.
So, John, we're wrapping up our discussion of the Abominable Snowmen. You've brought some really interesting takes to the table, and I certainly thank you for that. So let's segue then into your role in the Andy Frankham Allen verse. I understand that you've got a new book coming out.
Yes, it has finally been formally announced that I can talk about it a little more freely. The book that's going to be coming out probably around October, barring any further pandemic-related delays, is basically the grand finale of the Lethbridge Stewart books. There are two novels that have been written to lead up to the creation of Unit. Unit is the book line up to this point has been following the Brigadier's various adventures, working with a proto unit that's simply for the UK, being run by the British military. It's the Home Army 5th Operational Corps, which wonderfully their call sign is Havoc, and
Ha! Love that.
they have been serving the purpose of unit throughout the books here. And what we are doing in these last two books is basically showing how the Brigadier moves from Havoc to being part of the creation of unit as we now know it. Um, the last two books in the series are written by John Peel, who's writing the United Nations, and me writing Intelligence Task Force. And I have to say, by the way, that it has been quite a lovely experience actually working with John Peel on this sort of thing. There, I mean, when you referred back to meeting me on Red House Doctor Who and us having diametrically opposed opinions on a lot of these things here, it is astonishing how much I have mellowed out from those early days in fandom there, where you would nail your colors to the mast, and I can see a bunch of different sides of people's points of view on these sort of things here. I have over the years, I think, learned a lot from you, and I hope you've learned a lot from me. And I think that with John Peel, I have been absolutely surprised by how, despite our clashes back in the days when War of the Daleks was one of the divisive issues in Doctor Who fandom, we've progressed from that to actually being able to work together rather nicely on assembling two books that, while it's not actually a two-part story, the consequences of one have to bleed into the other, and we managed to cross-pollinate between the two in terms of coming up with some good ideas very effectively.
John, thank you so much for coming on the show. As you say, I've learned a lot from you over the years, and we've mellowed out each other's opinions, and we're no longer spending 90 minutes arguing about Frontier in Space. It was a pleasure to talk to you face to face, so to speak, and talk about Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen. I hope that you come back on the show at some point and talk about a future book.
Yes, I shall indeed. And as a final thing on Abominable Snowmen here, I just want to say that one of the opinions that I've mellowed out on is when it comes to Terrance Dicks. There were a number of cases where I thought that what he was doing was more typing than writing. But in the case of Abominable Snowmen, I am genuinely impressed by how, as with those other early books like Day of the Daleks, he has taken a TV story which has its problems, and he has really lifted it in the books. So full credit to you, Terrance, on that one.
And this is my show. I'll give myself the last word. Something Terrance doesn't get enough credit for, even in his shorter books, he always manages to put in zingers in lieu of straight prose. He's always managing to interject his opinions and thoughts, so you always know when he likes the story or doesn't like the story that he's telling. So here, at the beginning of chapter 7, that's page 76 of our paperback edition, this is the resolution to what I imagine is the part 3 cliffhanger. Not for the first time, Victoria's well-developed lungs came to her rescue. Too frightened to move, she let out a series of ear-splitting screams that echoed through every corridor of the monastery. That's hilarious. I mean, it's just, a simple stage action, Victoria screams, but he manages to make it witty.
Yeah.
Terrance's books are full of things like that.
Yes, never one for hanging about in anterooms. The Doctor, etc., etc. Just it's these moments of charm, as it were, that I think are part of what makes this book work well, and the combination of that and also a hell of a lot of moments of craft.
Yes, craft. That's the right word. John, thank you so much. Hope to talk to you again.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Blue Moon.
Special thanks to my special guest, John Blum, for joining me this week to talk about Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen. This is ordinarily the part of the show where I describe my physical copy of the book and how it's absorbed my fandom over the years. Interestingly, my copy of the Abominable Snowmen is probably one of the only novelizations where I never marked off the actual cliffhanger moments. I would have known the cliffhanger to part 2 at least from the VHS release of the Troughton years, and that would fall at the end of chapter 4 or page 60 in the novelization. I just never marked it off, and I'm not sure why that is. What I do know is how I got this book in the first place. My friend Steven somehow wound up with 2 copies, and he offered me a trade. I didn't have any duplicates, but I had recently bought and read the novelization of Time Flight, which at the time, age 12, I didn't like very much and figured I wouldn't read again, so I traded him my one copy of Time Flight for his spare copy of the Abominable Snowmen, and he kind of laughed at me, saying that now he had both books and I only had one. And he was right. I wound up going out and buying a second copy of Time Flight a little while later, and now I have a complete collection. My copy of The Abominable Snowmen is the 1983 reprint, which does not have a barcode on the back and has the older US price of $2.50, which had jumped up to $2.95 a year later, or 1 or 2 years later when I started buying the books. It is, visually speaking, one of the great looking 80s Target reprints, even though it does not have the original cover. This is the dark blue spine with the orange print, Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen, and the thematically inaccurate neon tube logo, which of course wasn't devised until years and years and years later, in orange outlined in white, with the roaring yeti with the red eyes and the glowing fangs standing in front of a very non-screen accurate snowy mountain peak. Terrific cover, even though it's not the original, and even though, of course, it looks nothing at all like what the TV serial itself would have looked like, being filmed in the late summer in a decidedly non-snowy portion of Wales. Next time, we'll be taking another short vacation from Terrance Dicks, one of the last for a long time to come, and we'll be discussing with another guest the entry of Brian Hales to the Target line. Special thanks to my special guest, John Blum, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor and can also be found on Spotify and Google Podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on the Trap One podcast from time to time. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, suggestions. Next time, we're moving on to 1975 and discussing Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.